All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. I am, of course, Dr. Robert Green II, your lead instructor for the Modjeska Simkins School. And tonight, we're going to change things up a little bit. Now, today is, of course, class 13 for the Modjeska Simkins School. Unfortunately, Brett Bursey is under the weather this evening. He and Becky, unfortunately, both have COVID. So please pass along your thoughts and prayers as much as you can. We're hoping they'll both feel much better. Brett and Becky both made the prudent decision to not try to come in today for the class. And as you know, class 13 is actually about organizing in the here and now. We actually pick up from last week's class talking a bit about the history of GROW and the Progressive Network starting in 1996 and coming up to the present day. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in our next class next week, our final class of the semester. We'll kind of combine that with class 14. But at the same time, we do want to encourage all of you to continue thinking a bit more about what sorts of projects you want to take on once the class is over with. Because one of the key ideas behind the Modjeska Simkins School is not just learning the history of South Carolina, but also thinking about what you can do with that history in terms of organizing on behalf of the Progressive Network. We'll be talking more about that tonight and certainly next Monday. Also, do not forget, graduation is coming up as well on the 22nd of June. Not this Saturday, but next Saturday. Expect to receive more details about that via email and also during next week's class too. So instead, we're going to change things up just a bit. We're going to finish up a few things from class from last Monday and also talk a bit about what the battle over history is looking like right here in the Palmetto State. In case you are not aware, the South Carolina State Legislature is currently debating some ideas over what to do with education in South Carolina, especially with teaching of Black history. The AP African American Studies course is no longer going to be offered in South Carolina as well. It's going to be a rally tomorrow at the State House about this issue. We'll be discussing more about that in tonight's class too. So what I want to do first before we actually get into any of that is actually go back to the end of last week's class. There were a few things I wanted to cover that we kind of ran out of time to do. But tonight is as good a time as any to pick up some of these themes. So we're going to do this for a few minutes and then get to the clip of Chris Cuney, a graduate of the Modjeska Simkins School, talking about what the school meant to him, and then getting into this battle over AP African American Studies as well. Okay. So one of the things that we were talking last week was about the importance of South Carolina to politics, both regionally in the South and nationally as well. And you might recall, we spent some time talking about these individuals, Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Lee Atwater. Now, I just want to say, after class last Monday, when I went home and got on YouTube, checked something, one of my YouTube recommendations was the film Boogeyman about Lee Atwater. First off, that shows just how much the internet has entered our everyday lives to where it knows you were talking about Boogeyman, weren't you? So you should watch it right now. And I said, no, I just want to watch some wrestling. So leave me alone for the moment. But again, if you're looking to watch the film Boogeyman about Lee Atwater's life and legacy in politics, it is on YouTube to watch for free as well, just FYI. But while we were talking about this last week, one of the things that I want to make clear is that the story of politics in the 70s and 80s and early 1990s is not just one of the ascendancy of the conservative movement. That tends to be the main story most historians tell, politically speaking, about this time period. But what's also worth noting is that there is a lot of pushback from progressive movements all across the country in terms of the direction the country was going. And again, we discussed Phyllis Schlafly and the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment last week as well. But again, some of these battles that we're talking about are still quite relevant for us in the here and now. For example, the very idea of overturning Roe versus Wade would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. And yet here we are. So we need to be really cognizant of how some of these battles in the 70s and 80s are still informing our politics in the first decades of the 21st century. Now, last week we talked a bit about the history of the Grassroots Organizing Workshop, or GROW. And again, because Brett couldn't be here this evening, we'll cover more of the history of the Progressive Network next Monday. But one of the things you want to keep in mind with the history of the SCPN, starting in 1996, was that it was born out of the idea that there was a need for an umbrella organization here in South Carolina that could really take on the issues of progressive organizing during a time of conservative power, not just in this state, but throughout the country. Keep in mind that 96 was 2 years after the 1994 conservative revolution in Congress. It was about a decade after the Reagan Revolution swept into power in the White House. And it was right as South Carolina's politics were also taking a distinctly rightward turn as well. But this rightward shift took different forms. We are most familiar, of course, with what's going on in Congress and the presidency, but you also have the ascendancy of far-right movements as well throughout the country. There is a wonderful book I'll make sure to have in the recommended readings for this week's email blast called Bring the War Home. Bring the War Home. I see you're shaking your head, so you know the book quite well too.
Yeah.
Bring the War Home is an excellent work about the history of the far right in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and how the far right was bringing together a wide variety of groups that had previously not really worked together, but found common cause during the Reagan era. So groups like the Ku Klux Klan, or neo-Nazis, or other white power groups. They began to come together to pool their resources, to come together for common interests. In fact, one of the things the book reveals is that they're one of the earliest groups to use the internet for recruiting as well, the 1980s and early 1990s, when the internet was very much in its infancy. But this collaboration of far-right movements also led to some incredibly violent outcomes. One of them, of course, being the Greensboro Massacre in 1979, where these 5 activists who were members of the Communist Party in North Carolina, who were involved in labor organizing and the like in North Carolina, were shot and killed in broad daylight by neo-Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I think this is worth bringing up, not just because it occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina, but because this was a precursor to the kind of far-right violence we've seen time and time and time again in the last 45 years. For example, up until 9/11, the worst terrorist attack in American history was what? Before 9/11?
Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma City, exactly. In Oklahoma City, that bombing in 1995, which was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh. People understand vaguely that McVeigh was part of the far right, but less attention is given to the fact that the guy was an ardent racist, for one. He was a white supremacist. If you read his manifesto about why he did what he did, it's quite clear race plays a critical role in his worldview. The same is true of what happened at the Greensboro Massacre, when members of the Communist Party, other organizations in Greensboro tried to confront the neo-Nazis and the Klan directly, and unfortunately, some of them paid for that with their lives. But this is the beginning of a modern era of far-right terrorism that you see in the 80s, 1990s. I would, of course, include the Charleston Massacre of 2015 in this same world. And to give you a sense of why this also matters before we move on, In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security released a report about terrorism, where they argue that the biggest threat to the United States was not foreign terrorism of any type, it was actually domestic terrorism, specifically far-right extremism in the US. Their rationale was very simple. They were concerned about the fact that there were thousands of veterans coming home from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with plenty of military training, some of whom had been radicalized by their experience in these conflicts overseas. They were unemployed, they were looking for work, they were looking for a purpose, a cause, and some of them were beginning to drift towards the neo-Nazis and the Klan and other far-right organizations. Now, this report came out in the first year of the Obama administration, but it had actually been commissioned and written during the Bush administration. And the report was quickly suppressed by the Republican Party because a large part of it actually lays some of the blame for this growth in far-right extremism at the feet of the GOP in terms of their rhetoric on a wide variety of issues, and also in terms of the alliances that have been made, local and state parties, with some of these far-right leaders. But the key thing to think about here is that while it's important for all of us to understand who the enemies of democracy, social justice, and freedom actually are, it is equally important for us to think about who our allies are in these fights and what things we can do to fight for these freedoms on the ground right here in South Carolina. Now, again, last week we discussed the history of GROW and how it was involved in a wide range of human rights movements in the 70s and 80s. Movements such as to fight against nuclear arms, nuclear power. This became especially relevant in the 1980s as the Cold War took a very, very frigid turn. In the early 1980s, most folks assumed that nuclear war was just around the corner. In fact, things were so bad that, for example, films like The Day After in the US or Threads in the United Kingdom became infamous for showing what nuclear war would look like and how horrific its aftermath would be. Organizations such as GROW led the fight against nuclear arms and weapons on the ground in South Carolina. We tend to think of these movements, again, as national, international movements, and they were, but they also had local and state components to them too. Same was true of the anti-apartheid movement. GROW was heavily involved in that in the 1980s. Modjeska Simkins was certainly involved in the anti-apartheid protests of the 80s. And what you're seeing throughout the country is a grassroots movement to really push back against apartheid in South Africa and against US support for the apartheid regime in South Africa. Even battles over things such as making Martin Luther King's birthday a national holiday took on significant urgency in the 80s under President Ronald Reagan. Now, of course, today we all know MLK Day as the one day out of the year where we all hear a certain part of the I Have a Dream speech. You know, if you're around every, I think it was like third Monday in January, you're watching the news and they play the exact same MLK clip every single January. Now, you all know as students of the Modjeska Simkins School that contrary to popular belief, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a few other speeches besides that one. But even in I Have a Dream speech, if you read it in its entirety or listen to it in its entirety, what you see is that Dr. King is talking about a vision of a beloved community, not simply trying to dismantle Jim Crow segregation, but trying to build a new society on the ashes of its old, decrepit, racist one. Now, of course, by 1983, while Martin Luther King Jr. was seen as a hero by many Americans, this sentiment was not universal. There were many on the conservative spectrum of politics who were opposed to making King's birthday a holiday for several reasons. Number one, it was argued at that time that the only people who had holidays on the American calendar were George Washington Abraham Lincoln, both for President's Day, and Christopher Columbus, right? And that was it. So they didn't think that King was quite as important or relevant as those people were. Also, there were many conservatives who argued, well, we think Dr. King was a communist. Should we be honoring a communist with a national holiday? Now, for civil rights activists, especially for folks like Coretta Scott King, you've seen this photograph here next to Vice Presidents George H.W. Bush and President Ronald Reagan. For them, it was important for folks to not only recognize King as a singular figure in American history, but to recognize what he stood for and what he fought for. President Reagan himself was actually opposed to making King's birthday a national holiday. He said, for example, that he felt that FBI records, once they were sealed in the 2020s, would show that King was a communist and that he had affiliations with the Communist Party. But facing a severe backlash in Congress, a backlash so bad that even our good friend Strom Thurmond was in favor of making the King holiday an actual holiday, President Reagan relented and signed the bill that made it a holiday starting in 1986, coincidentally the year in which I was born. But these battles over things like the MLK holiday were really, they weren't just symbolic. They were also efforts by leaders of the civil rights movement to say we were still relevant, we still had some importance in society, and we didn't want to let go of the lessons and the legacies of the civil rights movement and the larger Black freedom struggle. Again, keep in mind that this fight for the MLK holiday is happening at the same time as the anti-apartheid movement is picking up steam, as the fight against the nuclear arms race is getting stronger and stronger, as more Americans are protesting American actions to arm anti-communist forces in El Salvador. All of these movements were linked together and tied together. In fact, if you were in the Modjeska Simkins school building, the Grow building right now, many of the signs that are in this building are signs from the 70s and 80s. They are signs opposed, a part of the anti-apartheid movement, opposed to making more nuclear weapons and so forth. There's a sign actually right here, a sign about the 20th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. And at that 20th anniversary march in 1983, various figures, including Jesse Jackson, spoke about the need to resuscitate and to revive the civil rights movement into something even greater in the 1980s, 90s, and beyond. So this is the world in which GROW is doing most of its activities in the 80s. We, again, think of American history in the 80s as an era of conservative ascendancy, but we also want to recognize there were plenty of progressive movements on the ground trying to push back against this conservative counter-revolution. Now, one of the figures who's very important in all this, of course, is Jesse Jackson. And while we could sit here all night and debate Jackson's leadership style, which was a bit more top-down, and I think many activists would have liked, Jackson's runs for president in 1984 and especially 1988 really gave voice to not just these progressive movements on the ground, but they also gave a voice to the ongoing legacies of the New Deal, of the Great Society, Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and various other 20th century movements. Now, Jackson ran in the Democratic Party's primary in both 84 and 88. And for many Americans, not just Black Americans, Jackson came to represent the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, oftentimes giving voice to Democrats, men and women alike, who felt they were being left in the cold by the Democratic Party's turn towards the center in the late 1980s as a response to President Reagan. To give you a sense of what this looked like, I want to play a clip of Jesse Jackson's 1988 speech in Atlanta, Georgia, where Reverend Jackson lays out his vision for America and why his vision was so relevant to so many Americans at that time. So just pull up this clip. And again, as we're watching this, really pay close attention to how Jackson lays out a vision for American society.
Give praise and honor to God for being good enough to allow us to be at this place at this time. When I look out at this convention, I see the face of America, red, yellow, brown, black, and white. We're all precious in God's sight, the real Rainbow Coalition. All of us who are here think that we are seated, but we're really standing on someone's shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Rosa Parks. The mother of the Civil Rights Movement. I want to express my deep love and appreciation for the support my family has given me over these past months. They have endured pain, anxiety, threat, and fear, but they have been strengthened and made secure by faith in God, in America, and in you. Your love has protected us and made us strong. To my wife, Jackie, the foundation of our family, to our 5 children whom you met tonight, to my mother, Mrs. Helen Jackson, who is present tonight, and to our grandmother, Mrs. Matilda Burns, to my brother Chuck and his family, to my mother-in-law, Mrs. Gertrude Brown, who just last month at age 61 graduated from Hampton Institute, a marvelous achievement. I offer my appreciation to Mayor Andrew Young, who has provided such gracious hospitality to all of us this week, and a special salute to President Jimmy Carter. President Carter, President Carter restored honor to the White House after Watergate. He gave many of us a special opportunity to grow. For his kind words, for his unwavering commitment to peace in the world, and for the voters that came from his family, every member of his family, led by Billy and Amy, I offer my special thanks to the Carter family. My right and my privilege to stand here before you has been won in my lifetime by the blood and the sweat of the innocent. 24 years ago, the late Fannie Lou Hamer and Aaron Henry, who sits here tonight from Mississippi, were locked out onto the streets in Atlantic City, the head of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. But tonight, a black and white delegation from Mississippi is headed by Ed Cole, a black man from Mississippi, 24 years later. Many were lost in the struggle for the right to vote. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young student, gave his life. Valerie Soule, a white mother from Detroit, called nigger lover and brains blown out at point-blank range. Sergeant Goodman and Cheney, 2 Jews and a black, found in a common grave, bodies riddled with bullets in Mississippi. The 4 darling little girls in a church in Birmingham, Alabama, they died that we might have a right to live. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lies only a few miles from us tonight. Tonight he must feel good as he looks down upon us. We sit here together, a rainbow coalition, the sons and daughters of slave masters and the sons and daughters of slaves sitting together around the common table to decide the direction of our party and our country. His heart would be full tonight as a testament to the struggles of those who have gone before, as a legacy for those who will come after, as a tribute to the endurance, the patience, the courage of our forefathers and mothers, as an assurance that their prayers are being answered, that their work has not been in vain, and the hope is eternal. Tomorrow night, my name will go in nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
Now, one thing about that clip that I want to point out for a quick second, actually two things. Number one, Jackson was putting in the context the sacrifices of numerous civil rights workers in the 1960s in a way that you really hadn't seen in primetime television up until that point, where he's saying folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, Viola Liuzzo, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Martin Luther King Jr., so many others made sacrifice so that we could all be here tonight to have a chance to go out and vote. By the way, live in the Columbia area, there are plenty of elections tomorrow going on as well, in case you're not aware of that. Primary elections, general elections, and the like. So if you have a chance to vote tomorrow in Richland, Lexington County, or in South Carolina in general, please do so. But secondly, what's also important about that clip and about Jesse Jackson's legacy running for president twice was that he made quite clear his Rainbow Coalition was a real tangible thing. When he ran for president in 84 and 88, he wasn't just running for, say, the presidency of Black America, right? We kind of assume now that he was just running to get Black votes and that's it. That wasn't true. He was addressing, of course, the interests of Black Americans, but he also made it quite clear that he was running for Asian Americans, for Hispanic Americans. His campaign was one of the first in American history to reach out to LGBTQ voters in the primary. He actually had a moral foreign policy as well, where he spoke out on a wide range of foreign policy issues, such as criticizing America's arms race during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and also making a forceful argument for a fairer treatment of the Palestinian people as well, at a time when most Democrats and Republicans alike were not saying so. Reverend Jackson also talked about an expansion of the Great Society and New Deal programs. For example, he went to the Midwest. He worked alongside largely white farmers to make sure they saved their farms from foreclosure. Again, Reverend Jackson's vision of America was one that was very much about the grassroots and really promoting a vision of a true rainbow coalition, a true rainbow society that spoke up for everyone. But I think what's important to note is that when you have things like Jesse Jackson's campaign going on in the late 1980s, we don't want to forget the additional context of the LGBTQ movement going on at that same time. By the time Reverend Jackson runs for president a second and final time in 1988, the HIV/AIDS crisis has been going on for almost a decade. By 1988, thousands of Americans and folks all over the world have been infected and died from the HIV/AIDS virus. In the United States in particular, when the virus was first revealed to the public in the early 1980s, most American policymakers dismissed it. They weren't terribly concerned about it because they saw it as the so-called gay plague. For example, the earliest mention of HIV/AIDS at a White House press conference was around 1981 or so, where President Reagan's deputy press secretary was asked about research into HIV/AIDS, and the reporter was quite literally laughed out of the room. The deputy press secretary even responded to his question by saying, well, Why are you worried about HIV/AIDS? Are you gay? And the entire room burst into laughter. It wasn't until later on in the decade when the federal government began to take HIV/AIDS seriously. But by that point, thousands of people had died, and many more who had caught the virus felt they faced a death sentence. In South Carolina, the fight for LGBTQ rights, however, took a decisive turn when in the early 1990s, the first real gay pride rally held in the state was done in Columbia, South Carolina in 1992. Now, this is actually a photograph from that particular rally. You probably recognize the George Washington statue and the State House, or the steps to the state Capitol building. Now, let me just say, as someone who I've joked before has only been to the State House for protest, it seems like in the 12 years I've lived in Columbia, I cannot express how remarkable a sight this is. This would be remarkable now, but think back 32 years ago when, for example, the idea of legalized gay marriage was almost impossible to even dream about. Or having effective treatments for HIV/AIDS seemed to be stuff of science fiction. But women such as Harriet Hancock and many others in South Carolina really pushed South Carolinians to think carefully about how they treated people who were part of the LGBTQ movement. And I think it's worth emphasizing this right now. In case you have not been paying attention to the news, and goodness knows there are so many things going on right now, it's hard to keep track of everything going on. Part of the conservative movement's so-called Project 2025, their blueprint for if Donald Trump is put back in the White House next year, what they'll do after that. Part of that blueprint is staunchly anti-LGBTQ. I mean, honestly, you could say it's staunchly anti-20th century. But putting that to the side for a moment, despite the fact that I think many younger Americans assume that debates over things like gay marriage are settled and done, Project 2025 makes it clear, no, that is not the case. And I think images in moments like this, where you're seeing an LGBTQ movement in the Deep South, making itself visible, making itself saying we're here and we're not going anywhere, is especially important for us to think about. And by the way, one of the books that Becky Robbins has written, I'll hold up for the folks in the class, and I'll stop sharing my screen for a second, but I'll put this in the chat too. One of the books that Becky Robbins has written is a book titled Harriet Hancock, Mother of SC Pride and the Struggle for Gay Equality in South Carolina. This is a wonderful book about Harriet Hancock and her work with the LGBTQ movement, but it also makes it quite clear that this movement had many members in it. Many folks were responsible for making sure that LGBTQ rights were not simply glossed over or ignored in the Palmetto State. So again, this is one of the books that you can either get here at the Grow Building, or you can go online and download it. And I'll make sure to put a link to this in the chat and also via the email blast later this week. Okay. All right. So that's the end of my presentation from last week. Before we go on, are there any questions at all? Any questions, either from folks here at the Grow Building or from folks on Zoom? Before we go on.
Not a question, but maybe like a comment. That Trestis Theater just down the street here was the first theater to debut Angels in America in the Southeast back in 1995. Like, so there was stuff happening here, even in the theater scene, much as more progressive than Charlotte, because Charlotte couldn't put on the production there.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea.
Yes.
Great to know. All right, Sandy, I see your hand is raised. Go ahead, please. And go ahead, yeah, go ahead,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, Dr. Green. I was just wondering, I was having problems with my connection. If you could expound for a few seconds, just a little bit more about Reagan's position or opposition of the signing for the Martin Luther King holiday to become a federal holiday. Could you expound just a little bit? And what was the year that that took place?
Oh, sure thing. So I was chuckling when you asked the question because I could literally be here all night talking about this. But I'll keep my remarks brief. So basically, President Reagan, in his opposition to making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday, raised the same arguments that many conservatives did in the late 70s and early 80s. I should backtrack for a second, by the way, because the fight to make his birthday a holiday, Martin Luther King Jr.'s that is, actually began right after he was killed in 1968. The first bill to make his birthday a holiday was introduced to Congress, I think, a week or two after his assassination. And it kept coming up in Congress. In the 70s, what you see is that cities across the country, like Atlanta, New York, St. Louis, Philadelphia, make his birthday a municipal holiday. And then states gradually get on board with it. And by 1981, 82, 83, there is significant national momentum to make his birthday a national holiday. The best example of this, by the way, is the Stevie Wonder song Happy Birthday was actually a song written to highlight making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. That was the whole purpose of the song. And Stevie Wonder actually played an important role as like a leading cheerleader for making King's birthday a national holiday. However, President Reagan's argument was the following. Number one, he felt that Martin Luther King Jr. was not an important enough person to deserve his own holiday. His rationale was if you looked at the American holiday calendar, the only individuals who got their own holidays were Abraham Lincoln and George Washington with President's Day, Christopher Columbus with Columbus Day. And then, I forgot, I didn't include Christmas with Jesus. And that was literally it. And Reagan and other conservatives argued, well, does King really rise to the prominence of, say, a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln? That was argument number one. Number two was that there was a sense that folks were worried about losing a day of productivity on the calendar. If you introduce a federal holiday, then the government closes down, many businesses would feel pressure to close down. People were saying, do you want to lose a day of money making for a holiday? But number three, I'm serious, this was a built in. Number three, though, was that there were some, such as President Reagan and others, who felt that Martin Luther King Jr. had to have been a communist. And they said we should honor a man who was a communist like Dr. King. Now, despite those arguments, by 1983, there was enough momentum on the pro-King holiday side to where Congress could tell President Reagan, Mr. President, you can either sign the bill, or if you don't sign it, we have enough votes to override your veto. President Reagan didn't want to be the guy who vetoed the MLK holiday, so he actually signs it, has a celebration in the Rose Garden, all this stuff. Coretta Scott King's there, Jesse Jackson's there. They sing "We Shall Overcome" after it's all said and done. I'm very serious. But President Reagan's arguments against the holiday were threefold, those three arguments. And in fact, some of those were used to argue against making Juneteenth a holiday as well, especially the whole we don't want to have the day off people in the summertime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
All right. See a couple of hands raised. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to comment that South Carolina, I was just looking it up. South Carolina was the last state to make it a holiday. And in the same year, they also approved Confederate Memorial Day.
Of course. And I think some southern states actually give you the option of either having, I think, I think Mississippi has it where you can either take Juneteenth off or Confederate Memorial Day off. Don't think about that too hard. Next question. or comment. Yes.
Did they have legitimate reasons to think that he was a communist, or was it just because everyone who was smart?
Well, okay, so it's actually interesting you asked that question, because President Reagan said that there are FBI files that will prove conclusively that King was a communist, right? But those files won't be open until 2027, which is a couple years from now. However, some historians have seen some parts of those files and they're like, it doesn't show he was a communist. Now, on the other hand, Dr. King, did have affiliations with folks who were in the Communist Party, because if you were in the civil rights movement, you were bound to meet folks who were involved with the Communist Party or communist adjacent movements. I mean, that's something that we've learned from Modjeska Simkins' class. More importantly, however, if Dr. King were here right now, especially the King from 67 to 68, what he'd say is, well, I wasn't a communist, but why would that matter? For example, in 1968, about 2.5 months before he was assassinated, Dr. King gave a speech in New York celebrating what would have been W.E.B. Du Bois's 100th birthday. And at that speech, one of the sections, King talks about communism. And he says, actually, to your joke just a second ago, he said, you know, it's interesting that Boas and other smart people were communists. That should make us think a bit more critically about how we think about communism. And he kind of moved on from that after saying that. Now, based on what we know about Dr. King personally, like all of his writings, his correspondence, etc., Dr. King had critiques of communism. He had critiques in particular of Karl Marx's idea of materialism and his critique of religion and the like. But at the same time, Dr. King's critiques of capitalism that we often kind of sweep under the rug really pushed King to think more and more holistically about socialism in general. As a matter of fact, one of the things that he and Coretta Scott shared in common when they began their courtship in the early 1950s was that the two were very intrigued by theories of economics that went beyond capitalism. In their letters, they talk about things like communism, socialism, democratic socialism, social democracy, and the like. So King, for most of his adult life, was not a communist, but he certainly made critiques of capitalism. And he certainly gave some fair treatment to communist critiques of capitalism and the like. But in terms of President Reagan's ideas of King being a communist, it likely wasn't that he was a communist so much as he dared speak out for equal rights, which, you know, in the 60s, a lot of folks felt made you a communist. By the way, another quick tidbit, Reagan and King do coincide in the public eye in the mid to late 60s. Reagan becomes governor of California in 1966. King is very critical of Ronald Reagan. I think at one point, King even calls him a second-rate actor who becomes a governor of a major state. And then Governor Reagan was very critical of civil rights. He was opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He opposed the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Of course, I think many of us know that then Governor Reagan, for his support, the one time in his career for gun control to basically disarm the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1967, things like this. And so Reagan had, by the early 1980s, he had an established record of coming out against civil rights, which by the 80s, he kind of had, like most male politicians in the 60s, had to clean up for a broader American audience. But he couldn't quite let go of his critique of King. And by the way, standing to the final part of your question, they signed the bill in 1983. It becomes a holiday in 1986 that we have been celebrating ever since. Okay. So what I want to do now, we will have more time for additional questions at the end of class today. But I want to transition to talking about the Modjeska School and the very purpose of our school in terms of teaching history, teaching it the right way. Of course, on Saturday, we had Teach Truth Day across the country, hosted by the Zen Education Project. Here at Grow, we had a brief ceremony and discussion talking about teaching truth right here in the Palmetto State. There's a clip of that on YouTube right now. If you haven't seen it already, you should take some time out to watch it. And we'll pick up that conversation in a moment. But first, I would like to show you a clip of one of our graduates, Chris Cooney, talking about what the Modjeska Simpkins School meant to him. Now, Chris was a graduate of the school in 2022. Is that right? 22, right? Or 23?
Not sure. I think it was 22.
Yes, in 2022. Now, unfortunately, Chris Cooney would pass away about a month or two after graduating from the school. But he often spoke very highly of the school and what he learned in the Modjeska Simkins School. And he filmed his reaction to the school and how he felt about it. And I just want to take some time to watch this because I think it illustrates why the school matters to folks individually. But B, it also makes it quite clear that the kind of work that we're all doing makes a major difference. And when I say we, I really do mean the collective we. I'm not just talking about the work that I do with the school, or Chris does with the school, or Brett does with the school, or Becky does with the school. We all see this as a team effort. Each and every student who is part of the Modjeska Simpkins School since its inception in 2015 until now, plays a role in not only keeping the school alive, but plays a critical role in keeping true, unabashed history relevant in South Carolina. And this fight is becoming more and more important as the years go by. So let's go ahead and take a watch of Chris Cooney talking about what the school meant to him.
Had been corresponding, and for you young people, that means you take a piece of paper and you write stuff on it, and then you put it in an envelope and mail it to them. And we were corresponding like that back and forth, and I had told him about the difficulties I was experiencing, and he said, hey, well, come down here. Reagan just got rid of Vista. We need somebody to help with this food co-op. We don't really have a place for you to live, but there's a vacant house next to my house that's got a lock on the door, but it's not a very big lock. And so I hitchhiked down. It took me, I was really stupid. I should have taken the damn metro to the south part of DC, but instead I just walked up to the College Park exit and got on the interstate. It took me a day to get to Chapel Hill, and then it took me 2 days to get from Chapel Hill to Columbia. I spent the night in a pine forest outside of Patrick. Got dropped off at the State House. Merle Truesdale came and picked me up, brought me to Grow, and there I was. And over the next few
What year
weeks,
was that, Chris?
I'm thinking 82.
Reagan's still in office.
Yeah. And well, it's shortly after Reagan dissolved Vista, so if we could figure that date out, that would help us. But anyway, so I broke the lock off the door on the wooden house, and I cleaned up the downstairs enough that they could have the food co-op there, because when they lost Vista, they lost their Vista volunteer, but they also lost their HUD house. So now they didn't have a person to help with it, nor did they have a place. So the local magistrate, Glenn Davis, and his girlfriend, Hattie Frooster, came and checked the place out and decided it was okay. And Grow had some of these 35-gallon drum wood heaters that I installed and cut firewood for. And I ended up moving into the upstairs. It didn't have any heat, but you know, if you got a big fire going downstairs, it would be tolerable. Plus we had plenty of blankets. And yeah, I would get one meal a day if I could make it into Grow. John Carpenter would cook me a vegan meal. I really learned.
Was that the house out on Bluff Road you're talking about?
Yes, next to next to the cinder block house that Michael Gooding lived in. And
And
so
that the house that you're talking about, the wooden house, then became the Grove Food Co-op.
the downstairs did, the
Right.
upstairs became my residence, and then I shared the residence with other people from Grow. But it was a good way into town. And I'll tell you what, to learn about hunger is to not have eaten, get on the bus, get into Grow, and it's 5 minutes after John Carpenter stopped serving, so you're screwed. So you basically walk in expecting a meal and you're not given a meal. And that is a very, very special feeling that has given me empathy throughout my entire life, really. But I got $20 every 2 weeks from the food co-op. Plus I'd usually get a 50-pound bag of cabbage and some bunch of sweet potatoes, usually have those left over. On food co-op day, I'd take a pickup truck and I'd run to farmer's market, pick up bulk vegetables and Count's meat and pick up bulk meat. And
you were using putting food stamps in the bank and then being able to leverage the value of the food stamps with dollars, right?
I wasn't. Glenn
Glenn
Davis was. Yeah, this was one of the only food stamps and only food co-ops in the country that could take food stamps because it had been, I guess, because it had been organized through HUD. So yeah, we would collect $22 from everybody, and then we would allocate 20 of that towards actual food, and then the rest would go towards bags and I guess giving me my $20. And then I would work in the evenings later on at the Grow Cafe, serving beer to people like Venerable Tom Turnipseed. And then I guess the next major thing was the SRP6 thing.
What year was that, Chris?
SRP6, I think, was 83. I've got a good picture of it, though. I've got a picture of me with my arresting officer.
Well, they turn the pictures over. So what's your, like, the most vivid memory of the Grow building, the Grow Cafe, either both a political memory of something at Grow and then a cultural memory of something at Grow?
Well, I remember being shocked. This wasn't really a Grow, but more out at the Bluff Roadhouse. When I told people that, or when we mentioned, that we were into punk rock, well, the African-American community only had one definition for the word punk, and it had to do with being in prison. And so they were a little worried that we might, they didn't really know what that meant exactly. They thought that we were into some kind of weird sexual thing, but we introduced, the cultural thing was we brought the first kind of punk bands and stuff to Grow Cafe. Before that, it was a lot of, acoustic guitars and fun stuff. And it was all great. We would have all kinds of bands there, but we had a big punk rock party that I think was, and this was after Von Henman's had closed. I got there after Von Henman's, the punk club closed. So there was a good bit of people in Columbia that were looking for that. So that was kind of nice. Politically, I remember when we decided that the people that had the Superfund chemical dump out across from Westinghouse decided that the best thing they could do on a hot August day would bring all these Superfund chemicals right into the backyard of my neighborhood, which is right by Starlight and Bluff Estates. And then they would move it all really close to this African-American community and blow it up. And then when they blew it up, it would all go away. And I remember that we called out the National Guard, and we decided to slow that down. And so a bunch of us went out into the woods, and Brett went to the courthouse, and we got in the way of them blowing it up because we were going to get blown up too, and they were figured that'd be bad press. But I remember Sheriff Powell had a damn helicopter that could blast a siren that made it bounce off the ground, so it sounded like they were right in your backyard. I mean, right next to you. So I remember jumping in a damn ditch full of water and coming up behind some roots of a tree, sitting there for about 20 minutes waiting to hear people walking around. Never heard anything. So we eventually made our way out of the woods. By this time, Brett had gone to court, and we got kind of a mixed result from that. The Superfund people convinced the judge that as hot as it was and as volatile as these chemicals were, trying to move them back to the Superfund site could cause them to blow up and cause even worse damage than if, and make them blow up without all the explosive that's supposed to burn up all the chemicals, and it could be an even worse disaster. So they were given permission to blow those chemicals up, but they were also instructed that if they ever wanted to move any property, any of the toxins off of that property, they had to consult the Natural Guard, or basically get permission from Brett Bursey, so Brett Bursey would have time to go to court if they, in other words, they weren't allowed to do any surprise moves like that anymore. So that was a success in a way.
That's a wonderful memory. I'd forgotten all about that.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know about your time in the swamp there. That's quite moving.
Well,
So you want to fast forward to the bomb plant?
yeah, it was already organized when I got there. It was a protest at the bomb plant, and there were many legal entities that were planning on coming, churches and peace groups. And in the past, they'd had people like, I guess, Bonnie Raitt and Jackson Brown play at these things, but I never when I was there. But so they had the permit to demonstrate on the front lawn of the Savannah River plant like they always have. And then just a little bit before that happened, got a call from SLED telling them that that would violate your national security if they went on the front lawn, but not to worry. They found a fire ant infested briar patch that they could bush hog for us just fine. And it would make for a great place for a demonstration, only a couple miles from the bomb plant. So because of all the people who had been promised a legal demonstration, the legal demonstration was held in the fire ants and briars. But we did go up to SLED and tell them that this whole free speech zone thing was crap, and we wanted to get it before a judge. And so we told them the next day, 6 of us were going to actually go to the front lawn. Little did we realize that they were going to have a 3-foot wide yellow line painted halfway back from the street across the entire front lawn. And they had a crowd of people standing at the yellow line waiting for us. They ranged from the guy that looked like when Otis got to be a deputy on Andy Griffith to the DOE guy that had the little black curly thing in his ear. And I really wish we could have done it. There's a whole couple of scenarios I've gone through. And I would have loved it if we'd have gone up before the yellow line, spread out a big blanket, taken out a picnic basket, and just had a picnic. And they were like, but y'all didn't cross the line. It's like, yeah, I know. But anyway, we didn't do that. So we all just stepped across the line, and the Otis looking guy had cue cards, and he would say, do not step across the yellow line or you will be trespassing. And then, you know, you have stepped across the yellow. Finally, you are under arrest for trespass. And so we got taken into the DuPont building, and we got ourselves as we got as Arlo Guthrie would say, we got ourselves fingerprinted, photographed, and they shipped us off to Columbia jail. Now the fine on this hadn't been updated, so it was $1,000 fine, but there was no associated jail time with it. It wasn't $1,000 or 30 days. So we got to jail, and God bless her, Modjeska Simkins bailed us all out. And then they had a couple of hearings, and they, at some point, our attorneys said, well, we're all indigent. And they said, well, crap. And so they had to let us go because we don't have debtor's prison here. Well, we do, but we disguise it better than that. And so they had to let us go. And we waited, ended up we were able to get John Delgado. Even today you look at it and it was a star-studded performance. We had Modjeska Simkins in the audience, along with a bunch of people from the Aiken area, as well as other people. We had Henry Dargon McMaster was our prosecutor. It was like the only thing he ever prosecuted as the U.S. attorney. Everything else he got other people to do. Our judge was Strom Thurmond's ex-law partner, Charlie Simons. And our defense attorney was one of the best defense attorneys in the state, John Delgado, for whose services we painted his house. Had a 2-day trial. After the first day, one of the local farmers slipped somebody $35 and says, here, have lunch on me, but don't tell anybody I gave it to you, because although they supported us, it sure wasn't a popular thing in Aiken. And I remember at one point we found out that Charlie Simons had stock in DuPont. So we had a press conference and we said, yeah, we got arrested on DuPont property. We got booked in by DuPont security guards, got photographed in the DuPont mugshot room, and got fingerprinted in the DuPont fingerprint room. And now we're going to be charged. Now we're going to be tried in a DuPont town by a judge that owns stock in DuPont. Well, the very next hearing we had, Charlie Simons was very upset and swore that he'd sold his DuPont stock and he would not recuse himself. We had asked him to recuse himself based on that. So we had the trial, and we decided to get some big time guns on our side. So we invited Father Phil Berrigan, who of the electric boat company fame. He was the one that paddled into the electric boat company and poured his human blood down the launch tube of a Trident submarine and spray painted USS Auschwitz on the side, and then paddled over to shore, and the guards over there said, hey, you get out of here, you're not allowed to be in here. And he said, oh yeah, well, look at that submarine over there, does it always say that? And they were like, hey, wait a doggone minute, you come back here, we're going to arrest you. So he got arrested for that, and somehow the Catholic Church kicked him out for that, from being a priest. But he came down, and we had what's his name? The epidemiologist who had blown the whistle on the Rocky Flats nuclear plant. Apparently there had been a plume of cancers downwind from this this new nuclear plant, and he brought it to the attention of his authorities and said, look, you got this public health problem here. You got this plume of radioactivity causing all this cancers down this line. And they said, no, we don't. It was Dr. Carl Johnson. And he said, well, yeah, you do. I mean, the data's right here. They said, no, we don't. Shut up. So he stopped being their epidemiologist and I guess became more of an activist. They both came down. I don't know how we paid for that or how they were lodged or anything. My biggest memory of their visit was I had built a raised bed garden out at the house on Bluff Road. And when he got there, I had enough produce that I was able to pretty much feed us out of that garden for that day, the one meal we had together. And Judge Simons did not let any of the testimony that we had go in front of the jury. In other words, Phil Berrigan couldn't testify in front of the jury. He had the jury recused or excused, and Carl Johnson couldn't testify in front of the jury. I guess it was a compromise to let him testify, but make sure it didn't help the case. But John Delgado was just so helpful. Like, if they would ask us a question, did you step over the yellow line? Well, the judge wanted me to say yes, but what we had been trained to say, well, you know that South Carolina has the highest infant mortality rate in the country, and yet within a half mile of the Savannah River plant, it's twice the state average. And so I felt compelled to step over that line to bring attention to this fact. And I was like, no, you're supposed to say yes or no. So anyway, we answered all of our questions that way. And after 2 days, the judge gave his final instructions to the jury, which were, if y'all don't find them guilty of trespassing, I'm gonna find each and every one of you in contempt of court. And they found us guilty. The other wonderful thing about it was one day we got in there before anybody else, and we pulled back the curtain, and there's a 1930s Works Progress Administration banner or mural painted, and it's a picture of insurrection. And the state of South Carolina couldn't do anything about it because it was federal property, but there was nothing that said they couldn't put a great big movie type curtain in front of it. So the back of the courtroom, instead of having this mural of insurrection, had this nice gray curtain, but we looked behind the curtain. And once again, since we were indigent, once we were found guilty, they let us go. And I'd say,
Was John Penley at the trial? Let's back up on that piece.
the whole John Penley story is not something I'm real eager to talk about. John Penley jumped his bail. I think he did a year in the pen for that.
Really? I didn't know he did time. Did
Oh,
we
yeah.
lose any money?
Yes, she did.
She
And
did.
he apologized to her. And from what he says is, she says, honey, don't you worry about that. You just keep being an activist. And so he felt like that was kind of like his penance for jumping bail, is spend the rest of his life being an activist and a photographer of progressive movements. And that's what he did. Now he's in somewhat limited health, living out in Las Vegas, like a couple of miles from the VA hospital where he can get attention.
Well, I didn't know he was a veteran.
Yeah, he was a Coastie.
He was a what?
Coast Guard, Coastie. Coast Guard, the inshore Navy.
I got it.
Yeah.
I saw him a couple years ago before the pandemic at Wendy's house. I don't know if you.
I was there. I was there.
Well, Chris, I really do appreciate it because you've mentioned some things that I had to dust off, but I had forgotten completely. I forgot that you were tried in the Aiken County Courthouse, and that mural, that we can use that mural. We got to use that mural somewhere. It's still there. We need another field trip. We will, I'm sure, come back and do more later, but Becky just wants some, a couple of quotes. And I think we've got some good ones from you because you remember some stuff that nobody else has. And can you send me high-res photographs that you referred to? I mean, they need to be like in the megabytes as opposed to a few.
Okay, so again, that was Chris Cooney, who was a 2022 grad at the Justice Simkins School. And as you saw from the video, he had a long and lengthy relationship with GROW and with some of those activist movements on the ground right here in South Carolina. And again, before I turn the floor over to Josh and Gabby for a moment, I do want to show one image from some of the protest movements from the 80s really quickly to, again, give you some context for all of this. As Chris Cooney was talking about the fight against nuclear power in South Carolina, you also have, again, things like the Rally Against Apartheid, right? Where you have groups in South Carolina making common calls with groups from all over the world in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. As it says here, march and rally against apartheid, South Carolina, South Africa, one people, one struggle. So as we get to the end of this session of the Modjeska Simkins School, you take nothing else from this semester. I hope you take this with you. The work that each and every one of you will do after the class is over, whether it's the Monuments Project or the Missing Voter Project, or if it's other projects you come up with on behalf of the Progressive Network, or if you simply stay an engaged and informed citizen after you leave this class. Never forget the fact that you are not just part of a movement for peace, freedom, and justice in South Carolina. You are part of a global struggle for freedom and self-determination. It becomes very easy for us to think about, well, you know, I just want to get, for example, a street paved here in Columbia, South Carolina, which goodness knows there are a lot of those that need to be repaved, but I digress. Or you might say, well, you know, I'm fighting to strengthen voting rights in the United States, or I'm fighting for this or that issue. All of these issues are tied together. We are all tied together as human beings in a larger movement for self-determination, for freedom, and for justice for each and every one of us, regardless of race, creed, color, gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, and the like. And this is something that many of the folks we've discussed in this class believe in as well, whether it's a Martin Luther King Jr. or Robert Smalls, whether it's the Grimke sisters or Modjeska Simkins. These are the kinds of lessons that are so important to us precisely because they are under threat once again. To that end, I want to point out, in case you have not seen this, there is now a report out that the Department of Education here in South Carolina has made it quite clear that AP African American Studies will no longer be offered in the state schools. Now, originally, the idea had been to allow individual districts to decide for themselves to continue offering AP African American Studies. And in case you forgot, in the last year or two, there was some debate and discussion about AP African American Studies. On a national level, there were some who felt that the course curriculum was too activist laden, it was too activist friendly. It was, to be quite blunt, too honest about Black life in America. Now, there had been a pilot program here in South Carolina, places such as Greenville County. They had been doing it for 2 years, see how students would react to it. And now, of course, if you read the story, State Superintendent Ellen Weaver, she argued that there's been significant controversy around the course, and she basically overruled the State Board of Education to make this decision, to basically get rid of AP African American Studies. And there has been considerable frustration across the state expressed about this decision. Now, I don't have to tell you how important understanding Black life in South Carolina should be to any halfway decent education curriculum in this state. As you've learned from the Modjeska Simkins School, this state has a rich history of Black life in South Carolina. a history that is integral to understanding the state's history, and to be quite honest, understanding the South's history and America's history all at the same time. But right now in 2024, we face all across this country battles over how to teach African American history, and more broadly speaking, how to teach American history. The good news is that we're not taking this line down. We're actually trying to find ways to respond to this. So I would like for Josh and Gabby, two valuable allies of the Modjeska Simkins School, to talk a bit more about this subject, because we did discuss it in class and Teach True session on Saturday. We want to talk more about it right now. So please come on down.
Cool. I'm going to give a little bit of context, not specifically about the banning of AP African American history, though we'll swing around to that, but with H372, which is a bill that is currently sitting in conference. It's called the South Carolina Transparency and Integrity in Education Act. So as you can guess, it's an absolutely terrible garbage bill because it has a lot of beautiful sounding words in it. A little bit about where this bill is. So it passed in the House, passed in the Senate. The House had some issues with some of the changes that the Senate made. So then it went to conference, where they were going to send a panel of legislators to kind of create a compromise bill, though compromise between two warring, terrible ideas, I'm sure. But a little bit about this bill and what it does. So it bans certain concepts from not only any course of instruction, but also any materials. That would include library materials, etc. Some of those prohibitions are, quote, anything that teaches that an individual, by virtue of the race, sex, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin of the individual, inherently is privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. So it's taking the language of civil rights and basically attacking concepts like implicit bias or anything that would say that we should actively be interrogating our assumptions and our privileges. Yeah.
Okay. So just to give a little bit more detail about what the instructional material and what this oversight is that they're imposing. So it is not just books. It's not just having to approve lesson plans. It goes to YouTube videos, to photos that teachers use in classes. It goes to bringing in references for students to use. And this material has to be approved by a set committee that then goes to the state superintendent and the Board of Education. So that means that anything that has to do with current events, anything that could be particularly even possibly considered controversial would be banned from the classes. And the teachers, especially in public school, already have to submit their lesson plans months in advance. And so this would just further tie up what they're able to do and what they're able to share with their classes. And do you want to talk about the complaints?
Yeah, absolutely. But a few more of the things that are banned, just to kind of go a little bit more into depth than that. So also any content that implies that an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of the race, sex, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin of the individual. But basically what that means is any equity-based things where you maybe have affinity groups for certain, African-American affinity groups, or anything that basically tries to bridge those gaps would be discrimination against the people who aren't included in that. Also, anything that includes fault, blame, or bias being assigned to race, sex, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin. In other words, anything that teaches that white supremacy had an impact on these historical events or currently has an impact today would also very potentially be banned under this. Again, pay attention to how all of it is cloaked in the language of civil rights, because that's sort of their overall strategy. And in terms of the complaint system, so basically this bill would also implement a system where any staff, volunteers, parents, or students at the school could submit a complaint that these items were being used or that this is being violated. And then the institution has to follow up with an investigation, and there have to be corrective measures. And if it is able to be demonstrated that they either did not act quickly enough upon the material, or that there wasn't a corrective action, then the state will basically be able to withdraw 5% of state funds from that school. So in other words, it's basically creating a surveillance apparatus where any parent can, say that any piece of material is, not grade appropriate or is breaking these things. And so therefore, basically it's going to have a chilling effect on educators. They're going to go towards the least controversial things possible so that they can, avoid having these things kind of tie them up or potentially lose their jobs. So that's a little bit about what's going on with this bill. And that's the sort of context and background for the banning of the African American Studies AP course. And I don't know if you want to jump in now on that. Cool.
So this legislation has already been enacted in South Carolina. So whether officially or not, 2 years ago in a Lexington County School District, a concerned parent reached out and said that they had an issue with something that their child was taught, and they were going to bring litigation against the school. So the district could not afford the money to fight this in court, so they settled outside of court, which cost the school and the taxpayers an exorbitant amount of money. But also that teacher or that educator and that school now has it on record that they settled it, for this complaint, that they did something that they were not supposed to do. And that's basically what this bill is hoping for, is that the districts aren't able to go to court and to fight it. So even though this teacher actually didn't do anything and there was no evidence to support this parent's claim, that teacher is on record, that school loses money from the state in perpetuity because of this claim. So
one last thing about this bill, just because they couldn't help but slip in one more terrible thing. Also, it prohibits any mandatory training for teachers on gender or sexual diversity unless required to them as a corrective action plan. So any just like regular training on, gender diversity is not going to be accepted.
okay, so tomorrow we actually have William Hamilton, who's coming up from Charleston. He's an attorney and a longtime friend of the Progressive Network, is tabling at the South Carolina Education Association and the ACLU of South Carolina are presenting a press conference at 11 a.m. And they're going to be speaking about the AP course. They're going to be speaking about this bill because at 1 p.m. there is a public hearing with the South Carolina Board of Education where Superintendent Ellen Weaver is going to be talking to a lot of Freedom Caucus members. And for those who may not be aware, Freedom Caucus is the extreme right. They're also known as like the MAGA caucus. And this bill is really important for them to take down because they waited until the last minute of this House legislative session to bring this bill up, even though this bill had been in discussion for years now, because it's an election year. And this is a big, this could be a big win for the Freedom Caucus to get their supporters out on their side. So they are expecting that the public hearing is going to be packed with Freedom Caucus members. And so William Hamilton and some of us that were present on Saturday and invite anybody who's able tomorrow at 1 to come and speak at the public hearing or even just show up just to let them know that we're not going to accept this quietly. And I think what the big, I think the big takeaway from this is to read that legislation closely and to hopefully for us get on the ground, get used to being in these committee meetings and let our voices be heard.
I'll also say that the ACLU doing that press conference at 11, and I know Black Lives Matter Charleston, and I'm sure other organizations as well are planning a march from the press conference to the Rutledge building where that is happening. So that's another way to participate. That's at 11. Yes,
Is that meeting, the 1 o'clock meeting, available online?
that's a great question.
I think a lot of them are.
A lot of them are through the South Carolina Legislature app, but this committee is actually not on their calendar. So the Oversight Committee met today. This wasn't on their agenda. The Board of Education meeting that's tomorrow is not on the legislature calendar. So I'm not sure with that, but we can find out.
Yeah.
I'd also just like to say that last semester I took US racial and ethnic politics at the school with Dr. Shaw. And at the very end, we went through this bill and his curriculum and knocked off everything that wouldn't be allowed to be taught. And it's, spoiler, the entire class. It just goes to show that this bill is also, it's not only impacting secondary education, it's impacting higher voluntary education.
Yeah.
And it's basically eradicating any space for this to even be taught,
Yeah,
even if you're seeking it out yourself.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no,
Is there anybody that's like looking at how to use this legislation back against the people who drafted it, like, or their priorities, like getting the Bible taken out of the schools, get taken, like actually attacking stuff that they're fans of, just to kind of show them the hypocrisy?
yeah, I mean, I think that complaint system, I mean, you would have to be a staff member, volunteer, parent, or student of the school, but I think that you could make claims. You could, not that I'm necessarily also advocating for clogging up the complaint system either, but you can do there. I'm sure there's things with it that could be, creatively utilized.
So this is higher education also.
Yeah, I guess it's any state-based learning institution. I think it might only be K through 12. I don't want to say that for sure. That the ACLU
From what I was told from Dr. Shaw, which is not, I'm not speaking on behalf of the school, is that since the USC specifically is a state-funded institution, they have to give their curriculums to the state legislator to have them approve it. And a whole bunch of the stuff that we were taught this semester had to be taught not necessarily under, it had to be like a little bit more slick. And with this legislation coming up, it is going to be, it's also, going to impact USC's curriculums.
yeah, I'm not positive. I would encourage y'all to don't take my word for it.
Yeah, double check that.
And I want to emphasize all this. I'm also in the process of learning about all this stuff. I'm by no means an expert, just a horrified citizen. So cool. Well, thank you all so much. And also one thing that we can do is celebrate our wonderful educators who are doing great work, even on their birthday of all things. So Dr. Green, we have a card for you.
Thank you very much.
Be prepared, Josh.
And there's more ice cream.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Wait, are we?
Birthday, Dr. Green.
Everybody on Zoom and around.
Yeah.
We should.
Yeah. No, so that's all right. You do not have to pull up the Stevie Wonder. Which I did mention in class earlier. Okay, so
How did you get my
I greatly appreciate the kind words and the card as well. And I just wanted to say, because I do want to open up the floor for additional questions. Again, first, thank you, Gabby and Josh, for that presentation. This is, again, showing why the Modjeska Simkins School matters so much. But More than a few people asked me if they're gonna actually do the school tonight on my birthday. I said, well, yes, I will be there because I think this year more than any other shows why the school is so relevant right now. You guys were asking about the impact of this bill on higher education. I can tell you that having colleagues who work not just at the University of South Carolina, but at public institutions all across the country, that there is a noticeable chill within higher education when it comes to talking about race, identity, sexual orientation, and so forth. I am actually lucky enough in the fact that I do work at a private HBCU, Claflin University, and so we have not yet, I stress yet, had to face these challenges in the way that my colleagues at, say, SC State or the University of South Carolina have had to face in recent years. But the attack on teaching history is a broad-based one. In part, it's because of legislation like this, but also it's because of the fact that schools across the country, at least schools of higher education, are cutting history departments and programs left and right. In fact, there may be the very real possibility that before this year is over with, only Claflin University, out of all the HBCUs in the state, will continue to offer a degree in history. Other HBCUs have dropped history departments, history degrees. They still offer some history courses. But what is doubly alarming is that even without this legislation that we're talking about, we have a lot of students who move through the K-12 system here in South Carolina not learning about Stoner Rebellion, not learning about Robert Smalls, not learning about Modjeska Simkins, not learning about Septima Clark, or any of the movements that we've discussed in this curriculum. That's why I am incredibly fortunate that something like the Modjeska Simkins School exists. And what we are seeing across the state is that there are other grassroots efforts in Charleston, in the upstate, other parts of the state, to create basically citizenship schools, freedom schools, schools where we can talk about this history, this education in a worthwhile and forceful manner. My big fear, however, is that the way things are going, these kinds of schools may be the only places where this honest and forthright education can be taught in this state. And so this is a battle that we're going to all have to be a part of. It's a battle that's going to go on, I fear, for years, if not decades to come. Again, we often say that history is written by the victors. But I think what we're seeing right now is it doesn't matter who's writing the history, it matters how it's taught, who's doing the teaching. Okay, Cecil, I saw that your hand was raised earlier. Did you have a question or comment, sir?
Yes, I basically was wanting a question answered about what exactly does our governor, state, or Ellen Weaver have to say about what is the sovereign interest they have over us concerning this bill? I mean, they purport to be legislating for the common good, and they can do so. They can do some unpopular things if they were in the sovereign interest of the state according to our Constitution. So, have they identified what their interest is?
That's a great question, Cecil. And I was actually sent something by Brett today. There is a document on Ellen Weaver's website. It's called the Palmetto Promise. And this Palmetto Promise is a organization that Ellen used to work with, and it still has close ties. And this document basically shows what they are considering education, which is their interests, versus indoctrination, which they believe public education is doing.
Right, and this is again a document that Palmetto Promise actively gives out to people, and their whole argument is, and this is, I think, part of a larger national argument against, say, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, against AP African American Studies, and so forth. They're saying that their brand of education, which they argue is colorblind, is race neutral, teaches the true history of America, et cetera, does not slip into what they refer to as indoctrination, right? And if you look at this document here for a second, they use these terms in like scare quotes or in red lettering, like John Dewey or social justice warriors. Haven't heard that term in a while. They're bringing that one back. You've got their arguments against things like equity, right? So, for example, and this worldview is very important here. You've got this debate over, and let me just kind of zoom in here for a second, debate over equity versus equality. And their argument is that there are people who are within the progressive movement, folks who are involved in higher education, K-12 education, who are pushing for equity, but they're saying that traditional family values-oriented education is about equality. And you see the terms here, right? Equity is color, race first, or what they refer to as neo-segregation or anti-racism, versus equality, which they say is colorblind and emphasizes racial reconciliation. It also gets into things like economics, right? And it says that many of the folks who are involved in this more radical worldview are critical of capitalism. They are big fans of John Maynard Keynes. Again, this is their worldview. This is very important. On the other hand, they're saying that folks who are in favor of a colorblind education are big fans of free market capitalism. They're big fans of the economist Thomas Sowell, and they are deeply opposed to government intervention in the economy. But perhaps the most important thing for our class,
Eugene Debs,
right, is how they view the arcs of American history. On the and I think it's funny how they're using blue for this, right? But on the blue side, on the classical education side, their view of American history starts with America as a shining city on a hill, trying to fulfill their promises, etc. Their chief historian is David McCullough, which is funny because he's actually a biographer and not like a classically trained historian. Their political lens is individual rights. Their main heroes are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. The villains of this story are the progressives and Karl Marx. And they argue that most folks living in South Carolina who are concerned citizens involving education, parents, and teachers share this worldview because apparently Black people do not exist in their worldview. On the other hand, they say that the radical, the left wing, the people who are promoting social justice and promoting anti-racism, they see America as the oppressor, good always lost. And the goal is to overthrow representative republic for pure democracy. Yeah. Now let me again. This is really important because this is their worldview. This is how they view not just education, but American society. I think some of you probably heard the argument that America is not a democracy, but it is a republic. What's important to note about that is their argument is very simple. And this is actually an argument that comes from the New Deal era, when folks were criticizing President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies, his push to create or to really emphasize the average American in his programs, et cetera, that even James Madison, back in the late 18th century, when he wrote the Federalist Papers, some of those Federalist Papers arguing for the Constitution, he said, your republic is a form of a democracy. Like this is kind of the splitting hairs of this. Now they say that the chief avatar of this history is Howard Zinn, the writer of the People's History of the United States. Their political lens is interest groups and self-esteem. The main hero of the left and of this education is a friend of the school, Eugene Debs. And the villains are Christopher Columbus and capitalists. And then the adherents is what they refer to as the constellation of the left. The AFT, the NSBA, the NEA, the SCEA, SC for education, litigators, accreditors, and associations. Yeah. So, again, what we're talking about here, and what Becky and Gabby and Josh, excuse me, have talked about here this evening, is again showing what this actually all looks like, right? Because again, this worldview idea is really important. How Ellen Weaver and her organization and many of her supporters see education in this lens. Again, talking about education and capitalism versus indoctrination and socialism. Talking about Tim Scott's idea of equality versus Ibram Kendi's idea of equity. Again, these battles have real world consequences. Again, I've had colleagues who not only felt this chill in higher education, I have friends of mine who've lost their jobs because of the dramatic pushback against DEI programs across the country. It was only 4 years ago, during the upheaval of 2020, when it seemed every single corporation in America promised to donate money to fight for social justice. And a short 4 years later, most of that money has mysteriously disappeared or not been donated or been pulled back. Almost every university had a DEI program by the end of 2020. Today, most of those programs are either under threat or have been outright eliminated or quote unquote restructured. Yes.
I'm kind of confused as to why they've chosen to focus on like capitalism versus socialism as their lens here. Obviously, the whole thing is out of touch, but that part specifically seems really like red scary. Like that just doesn't. I mean, that's not like what's I don't know. Why are they doing that? Like, why is that the lens that they chose?
You know, I have a theory about that. But before I give my theory, anybody else want to chime in on that question?
I mean, they're big advocates for charter school, right? So bringing free market education into like the public education space, and they're like behind all like these voucher programs and stuff like that. So I think it like lines up with their own self-interest.
Also, socialism is a scary word.
Yeah.
To most people who don't understand, because if you talk about socialism, one, they can't define it. And two, they'll talk about places like Venezuela or something like a failed socialist uprising.
Which makes sense, but like to me, I'm like, well, that's not normally who's organizing these things. Normally it's more like racially conscious groups that are organizing, but the education aspect makes sense.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's also worth noting that in the last 15 years or so, we've had some serious challenges to capitalism within the United States. You had Occupy Wall Street. You have the growth of various labor unions the last few years, even in the Deep South. And so I think there are some people who are feeling the heat in terms of how we talk about things like capitalism, social democracy, and the like, in a way that has not been felt nationally in probably a couple of generations. Because again, these folks are not just talking about this material out of thin air. They are responding to what they see, as everybody's mentioned here this evening, just what they see as very real threats to free market capitalism and education around free market capitalism. Yes, go ahead, please.
Just a comment of like, sometimes it's just as powerful to let them speak and like, like just looking at what they're comparing, like, wow, these things are really, really good. We should actually teach them versus like, where they're trying to demonize something. All you have to do is let them speak and it shows what their values are.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. And again, this is a lot of what we're not only faced with here in South Carolina, but all across the country. Right. And this is what makes the Modjeska Simkins School so important. I will share one personal story that kind of ties it all together in a nice bow. So I want to go back to this idea of Christopher Columbus as a villain. So my first year teaching at Claflin University in 2018, one of the courses I teach every so often is a course on US history up to 1865. So theoretically, you could start in the Stone Age and get to the Civil War if you want to, but I'm not a fool. So I start with the world right before 1492, explaining to students, hey, this is how we get to where Christopher Columbus takes his voyage across the Atlantic. So I'm teaching this, and the students are already a little surprised because I emphasize things like, oh, there are these kingdoms in Africa that exist at the time and are very advanced, or the peoples of the Americas. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of civilizations in North and South America, each with their own unique languages, religions, culture, so on and so forth, large trading networks, all of that. And then I get to Christopher Columbus, and I mentioned to the students, by the way, in case you didn't know, Mr. Columbus made 4 voyages across the Atlantic. And the students looked at me and you could tell they were saying, wait, made more than one? I said, yes. And by the way, after his 3rd one, he went back to Spain as a prisoner of the Spanish government. What? And I say, well, he was a prisoner because he was governor of Hispaniola, and his reign was so cruel to the indigenous peoples, even the Spanish said, okay, you've gone too far. Which you can know anything about the Spanish in the 16th century says a lot about how cruel his regime actually was. The students were floored by this. Like I mentioned before, how even taking out Ellen Weaver and the Clash of Worldviews, all this stuff, there is a lot of work we have to do for students in K through 12 in South Carolina when it comes to learning history. One of my students told me after that class was over that she was genuinely outraged that she had not learned any of this in K through 12. That when she heard about Christopher Columbus, it was just about his first voyage, how he quote unquote discovered America, and that was it. There was nothing about the indigenous tribes that he virtually annihilated in the Caribbean. Nothing about what propelled him. Even the story of people thought the world was flat back then, which is patently untrue. Something that they keep learning about even now. My point here is that as someone who's involved in higher education, I see the impact of this kind of legislation on our students day to day, month to month, semester to semester. And the most painful thing about all this is that I know for a fact that once students are presented with a more truthful, more accurate portrayal of history, they actually want to do this weird thing called learn more history. I'm just being honest about this. They aren't just interested in learning about how much of a badass George Washington was. They want to learn the history of George Washington, warts and all. They want to see him as both the father of our country and as someone who owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves. They want to learn about Abraham Lincoln, how he saved the Union in its slavery, but they also want to learn about how Lincoln wrestled with his own racism and the racism of the white North. They want to learn about the history of capitalism in America, good and bad, the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, trickle-down economics, so on and so forth. All of these themes and concepts we've discussed in the Modjeska Simkins School in an honest way, students in K through 12 schools throughout South Carolina want to learn about, because by the time they get to college and they begin to learn that history in college, they are stunned by how much they learn, and they are more stunned by how much they did not already know. Cecil, your hand is raised once again. Please go ahead, good sir.
Yes, I just have a moment of hope for us. 3 days ago, a U.S. district judge pointed to the vagueness of a very similar law in New Hampshire and overturned it. It was focused also on banned concepts, limiting people from talking or teaching about race, racism, gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, but it was never clear in the law what exactly they could or couldn't say. They said it was like an invisible line in the classroom, so the teachers self-censored, trimmed their lessons of anything to do with any of that. And the penalties for violating the law of crystals they could lose their state license. But now that has been overturned in New Hampshire, and I certainly hope that can be the route that is taken here when it's litigated, and it will be litigated, certainly, or should be. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Cecil. No, you're absolutely right. Again, we don't want to lose hope. And we don't want to lose sight of the fact that this battle is not over. In fact, this is a battle we've had to do time and time again, generation to generation. I think about the fact that my parents, when they were in school, they went to schools that were thoroughly segregated. You know, my mom did not go to a desegregated school until 1970, which was, 16 years after Brown v. Board of Education. But they both grew up in environments, Black church, other Black institutions, where they learned this more truthful, honest history. And in fact, that is the very reason I'm standing before you this evening, that my parents in particular made it clear to me that no matter what I learned in K through 12, there was a much larger, more vibrant, more exciting story to learn about and hear about. And as soon-to-be graduates of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights, no matter what else you decide to do, remember that each and every one of you has within yourself the tools to expand this knowledge to other people, to talk to others about the richness of the history of South Carolina. And it's not just about John C. Calhoun or Ben Tillman or James Burns or Strom Thurmond or any of those other unsavory characters from our state's history. But there is a much richer and deeper history that if folks learned about it, will want to learn more and more about it. Yes.
I'd like to make a comment. I was in high school, late 60s. I graduated in 71, and I was in Iowa, and we had riots and protests to bring Black history into the high school. We did this in high school, and for it eventually to get to college. And at the time, they wanted you, when education wanted you to be a well-rounded person, you had to learn everything and decide where your place was in the world. I see it's gone the other way now, because I got a bachelor's degree in African American Studies, and I finished up my master's, and they were phasing out the program. So it took me a long time to get that master's degree because they were phasing out Black history in the college. But what these kids learn today, I substituted at a program we have at our church, and the kids are not cursive anymore. It's like, well, y'all just like a slave. Y'all gonna make an X. You're not gonna have a signature because y'all don't know, you're gonna print everything. I said, so y'all just like being a slave. Y'all just put an X and that'll stand for your name. But it's crazy to me. The kids only being taught cursive. How can you sign a check? I guess you won't be signing any.
Actually, to that point, historians are worried about that because what that means is they can't read cursive either.
No, they can't read cursive because we had them. I had the English class today, and we had them trying to do cursive, and this girl like, I can't even read that. It's a foreign language. It's like, Lord have mercy.
Lord have mercy is absolutely right. But I know, but I want to end the class on this because you brought up a bigger point here. The very goal of education now is up for grabs too. Again, think about the document we just looked at about extolling the virtues of free market capitalism. That is not a coincidence. Many folks who are leading higher ed in South Carolina now, what they are concerned with is making workers. They are concerned with making people who are just part of the workforce, just cogs in a larger system. They don't want students to learn, even taking history out of it for a second, just students who have a well-rounded, what we once referred to as a liberal arts education, which includes not just history, but philosophy, mathematics, the sciences, so forth. The fight over how our students learn and what they learn is a fight over what kind of citizenry we want for years to come? Do we want an engaged citizenry? Or do we want a citizenry that just goes to work, may only have pay attention to the news, not think hard about the world they live in, and that's it? And the thing is that this is not just a concern for educators. Even big corporations that have come into South Carolina in recent years, like Boeing and others, have said the workforce here is not equipped for the 21st century. They have said this time and time and time again. CEOs have told us at Claflin and other HBCUs and other universities across the state, we need students who can read and write. You cannot understand history or African American studies or philosophy or science or anything without being able to read and write critically. And critical thinking skills. Think about how important that is right now. If you go, I can go on Twitter right now, which I will not do because it's successful. But I can go on Twitter right now or Instagram, any social media site, and I can pull up all these photographs and images that are complete fakes, that are complete fabrications. And yet for so many people, it is difficult to determine what is real and what is not real. The 21st century is going to be a century determined by how much we embrace real knowledge, real learning, critical thinking, versus the onrush of non-critical thinking, the onrush of lazy thinking, the onrush of ignorance, and trying to deprive people of the right to learn what they wish to learn and how they learn. With that being said, we have one more Modjeska Simkins School session. That is next Monday right here. Hopefully, for those who just joined us or late getting the class, the reason Brett is not here is unfortunately he has COVID. He hopes he's feeling okay. You know, he's doing fine. He and Becky are all right, but they're hoping they feel better later this week. And Brett hopes to be back next week with us. But next Monday, we're going to cover the history of the Progressive Network and also talk about Organizing 101. How do you take what you've learned in this class and apply it to various objectives, various movements, various projects within the Progressive Network? We have some project options already available to you, the Monuments Project, the Missing Voter Project, etc. Or if you have an idea of your own, feel free to bring it with you next week. We have one last session next Monday and then graduation next Saturday, June 22nd. Expect to hear more details about that soon. All right, so, oh, yes.
One more comment. When they were playing that video, that gentleman, Chris, said that they were blowing up chemicals in the Lower Richland area.
They were planning to.
Yes. I live in the Lower Richland area. I live in Gadsden, which is a 99.98% Black community. Eastover might be 98%, but I don't know what Hopkins is. Hopkins is getting more influential, but it's amazing to me that they would do that in that area, you know, where they want to contaminate stuff that out in the woods where other people like them don't live. To me, it's amazing.
I'm sure it was sheer coincidence. Actually, I'll end the class on this. There's actually a broader point there that Chris kind of alluded to, but in the 80s, you have the beginnings of the environmental justice movement, where we think of environmentalism, right? The fight to preserve the environment for all people, et cetera. But in the 80s, starting in Warren County, North Carolina, 81, 82 or so, you have the beginnings of the environmental justice movement, where in particular, activists of color were saying environmentalism looks different in, say, a largely Black or brown place, but they're trying to dump chemicals, nuclear waste, et cetera. And they're doing this all on purpose because we happen to live here and we are seen as expendable. The problem right now is that it seems that we live in a country in a time period in which more and more Americans are seen as expendable, whether it's the environment or broader ideas of neoliberalism or the like, which is why, again, it brings me hope that each and every one of us is here this evening to continue the fight to make our society the kind of society that's decent and worth living. So I'm going to enjoy the rest of my birthday somehow, in some way, and everyone keep the faith, and I'll see you all next Monday. Until then, keep Brett and Becky your thoughts and prayers, and hopefully we'll see them back next week as well. Until then, have a good rest of your week.
Open your car.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.